Ann Arbor is a city that lives on ideas, and that is exactly why someone chose to turn it into a laboratory. 5 deaths, 5 impeccable scenes, no useful evidence, and always the same encrypted note, left as if it were an academic seal. Teach my work. The question isn't just who did it. The question is, why does someone need so badly to be studied that they kill to become a reference? Part 1. Ann Arbor, Michigan. A winter that bites slowly, with a thin wind cutting through the bare trees as if searching for cracks. The university town usually carries an organized silence. Libraries, cafes, campus corridors, people who live off ideas. But that night, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of concentration. It was the silence of restraint. Downtown, a mid-range hotel, the kind that hosts guest lecturers, visiting authors, conference experts, was closing out another day. Staff cleared trays, an elevator swallowed and released people in small groups. The carpet absorbed footsteps without complaint. Until a sound off-script interrupted the logic of the place. A dull, distant impact, followed by a sequence of screams that didn't belong in that kind of building. When the security team arrived outside, there was a person lying on the ground floor, near the side entrance area, where the lighting is too harsh to be welcoming. A body that should have been on the 5th floor minutes earlier. A scene that at first glance fit neatly into an easy word. Fall, a jump, an ending. But in crime, easy words are traps. The first local police patrol responded quickly. Tape going up, crowd control, radio calls. The early morning cold turned breath into vapor, and even so, someone had the feeling the environment was hot. Hot with anxiety, haste, fear. This wasn't just another call. It was a chapter. Inside the hotel, the 5th floor was too clean. The door to the victim's room remained closed as if no one had dared to disturb the narrative before the police arrived. When officers entered, the room looked like an advertisement. Bed perfectly made, bathroom without apparent marks, trash nearly empty. No glasses out of place, no clothes scattered, no obvious signs of struggle, panic, or improvisation. The window, or balcony depending on the architecture, was unlocked, its opening suggesting a sudden decision. Everything seemed to stage the conclusion in a comfortable way. Then came the first dissonance. The victim was someone connected to criminology, a criminal behavior researcher, the kind who cites cases as examples and teaches patterns as if they were maps. Someone used to explaining other people's minds. Finding them fitted into a simple ending wasn't impossible, but it was unlikely in the right way. The kind of improbability that doesn't shout. It whispers. The forensic team started with the basics that don't show up in TV shows but decide stories. Angles, distances, chronology. The hotel provided entry records, keycard data, the guest list. The 5th floor hallway had a camera at one end, the elevator had another. The problem was that where the footage should have clarified things, it only confirmed emptiness. No recorded visits, no lingering faces, no dramatic moment. Just the victim entering the elevator, walking down the hall, disappearing into their own room. And then, nothing. A case like this would normally be resolved with a word that also acts as comfort. Sadness. But the officers had already learned in recent weeks that comfort is dangerous in Ann Arbor, because this was the 5th crime with the same invisible signature. It all began months earlier, when a visiting professor attending a seminar was found dead in a short-term rental apartment. The scene was a hanging, the word arrived pre-packaged in everyone's ears, and yet there was a strangeness to it. No mess, no marks beyond what was expected, no sign of forced entry. The investigation went in circles, more due to a lack of contradictions than a lack of questions. The case seemed closed too early, as if someone had drawn the ending and erased the path leading to it. The second came like a cruel footnote. A retired forensic expert, known for writing articles about classic mistakes in crime scenes, was found dead at home. There were signs consistent with intoxication, but nothing that immediately pointed to a specific agent. The environment had been cleaned with almost clinical discipline. No glasses with useful fingerprints, no obvious residues, no trail that allowed chance to help. It was as if chance itself had been outlawed. The third was a blow to the head, or in technical terms, a trauma that could be accidental under certain circumstances. The problem was that the circumstances seemed assembled to fit an explanation, not to give birth to one. The location didn't offer the spontaneous chaos of an accident. It offered symmetry, and symmetry in investigation is rarely innocent. The fourth looked the most conclusive, a gunshot to the chest in a lightly used parking lot, with everything suggesting a robbery gone wrong. Except the robbery didn't exist anywhere beyond the scene itself. There were no coherent witnesses, no clear escape route, nothing that held up when you tried to turn assumption into a timeline. And in all four cases, always the same irony. A note. A small piece of paper almost without personality placed so that someone would find it, but only after the initial shock had passed. Sometimes inside a book, sometimes under a coaster, sometimes folded inside an envelope with no return address. Never with useful fingerprints, never with a trace of haste, never with the kind of showmanship that vain killers usually display. The note was encrypted, not as a theatrical challenge, but as a filter. As if it said, "Only those who truly understand this will hear me." And when the message was decoded by specialists called in urgently, it repeated the same phrase, cold and perfectly self-aware, "Teach my work." In the fifth crime, the note reappeared in an almost offensive way. Not on the body, not on the window, but inside the room, next to the hotel notepad, as if it had been borrowed to serve as a backing. A small detail, but a loaded one. The message was where someone who thinks like an academic would think to put it. Near stationery, writing, record-keeping. As if the killer were speaking to a specific audience, using the scene itself as language. The police looked at that and felt the same thing that had been growing, case after case. This wasn't just a killer. It was a replicator, an author, an individual who didn't just want to kill, they wanted to build cases. Cases that could be studied, cases that seemed flawless, cases that forced professors, experts, and writers to cite his name, even without knowing who he was. The city began to change, not in the streets, in the mind. Professors started varying their routes. Experts began avoiding predictable routines. Conference speakers grew suspicious of invitations. Because the pattern was clear enough to frighten and clean enough to humiliate, the victims had ties to criminology, and the scenes were so perfect, they seemed to mock the investigative method itself. That night in the hotel, a veteran detective walked down the fifth-floor corridor like someone crossing an empty classroom. He felt, without being able to prove it, that he was being observed, not by eyes, but by intent. A sense that someone had passed through calmly, without running, without stumbling, without leaving anything by accident. Someone who treated the scene like an experiment, someone who trusted their own control. Outside, sirens were still washing the building in blue and red. Inside, the room maintained an unsettling order, and at the center of everything, that note, the same phrase repeated like a thesis. Teach my work. It was the kind of provocation that doesn't ask for attention. It demands it. And in that moment, even before any backup arrived, before any specialized unit was called in, the city understood a simple and dangerous truth. The killer wasn't trying to escape the investigation. He was trying to right it. Part 2. Ann Arbor woke up with a kind of collective hangover. It wasn't just the news. It was the feeling that the city was being used, not as a stage, but as a laboratory. Throughout the morning, information spread in layers. First the jump, then the fifth case, then the detail that always came back like an uncomfortable refrain, the encrypted note. Local police were no longer treating it as a string of isolated incidents. It was a series, and more than that, a series with intent. There was too much regularity in the choice of victims, and too much discipline in how the scenes were cleaned. What at first looked like statistical coincidence now had the look of a signature. All that was missing was what matters most in a signature, the mind behind it. This is where the case moves beyond ordinary jurisdiction and enters a zone where traditional techniques start to fall short. Not because of investigative failure, but because of the limits of the terrain itself. When someone with technical knowledge commits crimes meant to be didactic, the method becomes the target. The criminal starts anticipating procedures, steering conclusions, planting a ready-made story. And if the police don't change their lens, they risk becoming characters in a narrative written by someone else. The call to the MINDTRACE Division didn't come as a request for help, but as an acknowledgement of an impasse. The unit, created in the US in 2016 to handle cases where physical evidence is scarce and behavior is the primary proof, existed for exactly this reason: to chase mental patterns when material traces aren't enough. MINDTRACE doesn't arrive as a spectacle. It comes in quietly, like someone who walks into a room and turns off the bright lights to see what was hidden by the glare. Oversight of the case fell, as always, to Dr. Liz Murray, a specialist in trauma profiles, subconscious language, and behavioral micro-decisions. Liz isn't just looking for who did it. She's looking for why someone would need to do it this way. Beside her was Agent Jay Carter, a neurobehavioral analyst who works where most don't: in repetition. Jay isn't impressed by perfect, he's suspicious of it. Perfection, in crime, usually signals excess control, and excess control always charges a price somewhere. The third member, Mark Henderson, a specialist in symbolic reconstruction and field profiling, is the one who turns details into maps. To Mark, a clean scene still speaks, because cleaning is also an action. There is no neutral absence, there is only absence that was produced. The briefing was set up in a reserved room inside the hotel itself, far from common areas. A simple space, table, whiteboard, bad coffee, folders with photos and reports. The setting matched the core idea of the case: a crime that looks like a lecture, investigated inside a place that hosts lectures. Local authorities presented the history with weary objectivity. 5 deaths in sequence, with different methods, but one fixed element: the feeling of premature closure. In every scene, the narrative seemed ready-made. In every scene, the lack of useful evidence was almost offensive, as if someone had erased the path and left only the ending. MINDTRACE listened and didn't look for impact. It looked for pattern. The victims formed a specific set: criminology professors, experts with public track records, writers and speakers who turn crime into material for study. People who talk about cases, people who teach method, people who in essence occupy the symbolic position of authority over crime. And someone was hunting precisely that. Not the ordinary individual, but the one who interprets, explains, who gives language to horror. The city then stopped being just a point on the map. It became a showcase, a place with a flow of specialists, events, conferences, academic visits. A perfect ecosystem for someone who wants to choose victims with resumes and predictability. And more perversely still, perfect for someone who wants the crime itself to be published, discussed, analyzed in classrooms. The encrypted note, repeated in every case, wasn't just a message, it was a device. The encryption worked like natural selection. It would only draw the attention of those with the background, the technical patience, the belief that deciphering is part of the game. It wasn't a scream, it was a password. And when the message was revealed, it was always the same: teach my work. To MINDTRACE, that didn't sound like adolescent provocation or a common threat. It sounded like a thesis, a sentence written by someone who doesn't just want to be feared, they want to be referenced. They want to become a source, they want to exist as a concept. From there, the briefing shifted in tone. It moved from "what happened" to "what does this mean?" Dr. Liz Murray steered attention toward an uncomfortable idea. The offender didn't seem motivated by material gain or chaotic impulse. What emerged was intellectual narcissism, the need to be recognized as superior, not by force but by technique. The killer doesn't just want to beat the police. He wants to beat the police's language. He wants to beat the academic method. He wants to be the case that specialists can't close. Jay Carter highlighted a point many overlook. Varying the method of death is a way to confuse an eye searching for superficial patterns. It's like changing the font of a text to make it look like a different author. But the real signature wasn't in the method. It was in the structure. Victim selection, scene construction, elimination of traces, and the note as the final stamp. Mark Henderson focused on the invisible aesthetics. The hotel room, for instance, was too tidy. That isn't just cleanliness, it's staging normality. It's an attempt to make the observer accept a script without asking questions. And when someone tries to prevent questions, it's because they know which questions hurt. The internal name that began circulating among investigators, still unofficial, was straightforward: the Replicator. Not because he copies methods, but because he replicates a concept: flawless crimes produced as if they were experiments, as if each death were an article, and the city a macabre scientific journal waiting for publication. MINDTRACE accepted the case with a clear understanding. The immediate objective wasn't just to identify suspects. It was to reclaim control of the narrative, to remove the criminal from the role of professor, and return to the investigation the role of author. By the end of the briefing, one conclusion settled in, silent and heavy. If he wants his work taught, then he will keep producing material. And a criminal who sees himself as a reference doesn't stop when ignored. He escalates when he isn't cited. The question left hanging in the air wasn't who, it was, what rule is he following, and where will that rule fail? Part 3. MINDTRACE's first decision that morning was simple, but counterintuitive. Stop looking at how people died and start looking at how the scenes were built. In serial killings, the method is usually the loudest clue. Here, it was noise. The Replicator alternated hanging, poisoning, blunt force trauma, gunshot, and a staged fall, not because those means were the objective, but because they were different frames for the same painting. He wanted investigators to get lost on the surface, one case of each type, while the real signature remained intact. Control, cleanliness, induced conclusions, and the silent humiliation of the method itself. Dr. Liz Murray began with the least discussed and most revealing element: the choice of audience. In common crimes, the victim is often opportunity. Here, the victim was message. Professors, experts, crime writers, people who, in life, turned violence into knowledge. The killer wasn't just striking individuals, but the idea of intellectual authority. It was as if he were saying, "You teach crime, now you're going to study mine." That alone pointed to a dominant trait: intellectual narcissism. Not the stage kind, but the lectern kind. The need to be recognized not as famous, but as a reference. The phrase, "teach my work," didn't carry the tone of a request. It carried the tone of someone who believes they are above judgment. As if police, universities, and the press were merely vehicles to publish what he produces. Jay Carter, through his neurobehavioral lens, translated this into a practical concept. The Replicator isn't just trying to avoid capture. He's trying to control perception. His brain seems to operate on an architectural logic, creating an experience for others. And when someone tries to control how the world perceives an event, there are usually two things underneath: a need for superiority and a deep fear of being seen as ordinary. MINDTRACE then turned to what everyone had been calling perfection. The term was dangerous. Perfect gives the offender the credit he wants. And technically, it's also wrong. Scenes without obvious evidence are not scenes without evidence. They're scenes where the evidence has been displaced into behavior. Mark Henderson proposed a reading rule. Instead of looking for what exists, look for what should exist and isn't there. Absence becomes material. A hotel room that's too clean speaks, because hotels are places of transit and mild disorder. A glass, a stray hair, signs of use. When everything is aligned, someone spent energy aligning it. Energy means time. Time means calm. Calm means confidence. And confidence, in a criminal, rarely comes from nowhere. They listed the common points across the 5 cases in 3 layers. 1. Operational layer, scene discipline. The reports showed consistent patterns: lack of usable prints, lack of typical residues, approach and exit routes that avoided witness contact, and an overall organization that reduced the chance of contradictions. It wasn't just caution, It was procedural ritual, as if he were repeating a mental checklist. 2. Narrative layer, induction of easy explanations. In each case, the scene told a simple story: suicide, accident, robbery, tragedy. The replicator seemed to build comfortable endings so the investigation would close quickly. And then came the note, like a second psychological blade. After offering an ending, he mocked the conclusion. Teach my work. In other words, you thought it was easy, then you're predictable. 3. Symbolic layer, crime as publication. The encryption was more than a trick. It was audience triage. He didn't want just anyone reading it. He wanted the right eyes, trained eyes, vain eyes, eyes that enjoy deciphering. That matters. He doesn't communicate with the victim. He communicates with the community. And communities have their own vanities. The team began treating the series as a status conflict, an individual trying to dispute hierarchy with institutions. It wasn't just police versus killer. It was method versus anti-method, an author trying to write about those who always do the writing. The analysis moved to a question: why vary methods but keep the same motto? The likely answer was that the replicator has knowledge of criminology and of how criminologists think. He understands how investigations prioritize patterns and how professors turn cases into material. By diversifying the means, he makes it harder to build a superficial profile. The hanger, the poisoner. He forces the lens to move up a level. At the same time, he creates a portfolio, a catalog, almost a bibliography of deaths. That's narcissism in the form of a resume. But there was something else, a possible sadistic component that doesn't depend on explicit physical pain. The sadism here is cognitive. It's the pleasure of confusing, of watching institutions stumble, of witnessing another's frustration. The replicator seems to feed on the moment when a competent person says, "There's nothing here," and then realizes that precisely that, "there's nothing," was placed there on purpose. MINDTRACE then decided to map what they call vanity points, places where an intellectual narcissist can't resist exposing himself, even minimally. Excessive control. When someone needs everything to look clean, they may leave traces of cleaning, repeated patterns, zones that are too clean in contrast to the rest, standardized choices of products or techniques. Language signature, encryption, and a repeated phrase suggest a mental style. Even without long text, there is rhythm and intent. Need for an audience. He wants publication. That implies following media, academic forums, podcasts, conferences, and possibly trying to influence what will be said. That pointed to the first field path, where the offender watches his own spectacle. Jay Carter suggested that the replicator likely consumes investigative and criminology content with the same intensity that he produces the series. He may attend events, lectures, university libraries, discussion groups, even digital environments where cases are debated in technical language, not to learn, but to measure impact, to see if he's being taken seriously. Dr. Liz Murray pulled another thread: victim selection, all connected to criminology but with different roles. Professor, expert, writer. That seems less random and more curatorial. As if each death represented a chapter about a part of the system: academia, forensics, public narrative. He doesn't just want to kill people, he wants to strike the pillars that turn crime into knowledge. Mark Henderson brought the hotel to the center of the symbolic reading. A hotel is a place of passage, controlled anonymity, cameras and routines. If he chose it, it's because he wanted to prove he can operate in monitored environments. It's a way of saying, even in the most watched place, I'm in control. A challenge to the very concept of security. Then came the most dangerous and most useful hypothesis. The replicator may be planning a sixth crime as a response to the level of attention he's receiving. Intellectual narcissists don't like silence. If the city tries to suppress, he amplifies. If the press gets it wrong, he corrects with another example. At that point, MINDTRACE set an immediate goal. Stop reacting and start anticipating. If he creates crimes to be studied, then he follows a curriculum logic. And curricula have progression. They escalate. They have a final exam. The question that guided the end of the initial analysis was written on the board, without drama, like a lab sentence. What's the next lesson he wants to teach? Because when a criminal sees himself as a professor, every scene isn't just a crime. It's a lesson. And every lesson sooner or later demands a bigger demonstration. Part 4. The reconstruction of the fifth crime began where the replicator believed he had already won. Routine. Because perfect scenes depend on a belief. The belief that police will look at an event as an isolated moment. MINDTRACE, on the other hand, treated the hotel as an organism. People moving through it. Schedules, layers of access, behavioral patterns that don't appear in forensic photos. The first step was to build a timeline that didn't rely on assumptions. Jay Carter insisted that every minute be supported by something verifiable. Electronic key records, cameras, bar point-of-sale data, elevator logs, employee schedules, and even small routine signatures like shift changes and cleaning patterns. What emerged was a picture without noise, and paradoxically, that was the first sign of interference. The victim checked in late in the afternoon, picked up the key, followed the normal flow, appeared on camera in the lobby and then in the elevator. The hallway camera captured the walk to the room. Nothing strange, nothing theatrical. The kind of normality investigations usually dismiss as of no interest. But Mark Henderson flagged it on the board as a warning. Serial normality is sometimes a mask. The next focus was the room. Traditional forensics swept the obvious surfaces and found what was expected. Almost nothing. No usable fingerprints, no foreign material in typical contact areas. The bathroom looked recently used but without disorder. The bed was made in a way that didn't match someone who had just settled in for a night at a hotel. That's where behavioral reading came in. That bed wasn't made the way staff make it. It was aligned the way someone aligns a scene to look neutral. MINDTRACE asked to compare room by room the hotel's housekeeping patterns, discreetly photographing vacant rooms ready for new guests and occupied rooms that had received service. The result was simple and devastating. The hotel's neutral includes small imperfections. The sheetfold isn't millimetric. The blanket falls with slight asymmetry. One pillow is always a bit off the ideal angle. In the victim's room, none of that existed. Everything was too correct, like a scale model. That indicated a presence that did not want to be perceived as a presence. The second step was the fifth-floor hallway. The hotel had a camera at one end, but it didn't cover the entire length. That created a blind zone. And blind zones are where common criminals hurry. The replicator, however, seemed to work like someone who knows the reach and the limits of every lens. Video analysis showed no running, no classic suspicious figure. Instead, it showed long stretches of nothing. A nothing that, in ordinary cases, would be interpreted as absence of crime. Mark Henderson reversed the reading. The nothing was manufactured. They mapped the flow of people on the floor. Guests who went out to smoke, couples returning from dinner, a maintenance worker checking an ice machine, and a housekeeper pushing her cart toward the service area at the end of her shift. The detail wasn't in what stood out too much, but in what seemed too small to make the report. The housekeeper reported seeing the Do Not Disturb sign on the victim's door earlier than would be usual for someone newly checked in. In hotels, that sign is a micro gesture of control, and the replicator loved control. But the sign could have been placed by the victim herself, or by someone who wanted to reduce the chance of interruption. Jay Carter introduced an element rarely used as evidence and almost always treated as intuition: interruption behavior. Someone planning a flawless scene fears interruptions more than investigation. Interruption is chaos. Interruption is what creates traces. That led MINDTRACE to ask, what in that hotel could interrupt someone on the fifth floor? The answer came as a list: room service, maintenance, housekeeping, noisy guests, alarms, and the elevator. The hotel provided elevator records by time slot. Nothing screamed out. But one thing stood out. During a certain interval, the elevator briefly stopped on the 5th floor without a corresponding lobby camera recording an entry into the building. This wasn't proof of intrusion. It could have been someone already inside the hotel. But it was a question mark. A visitor who used the stairs? A guest from another floor? An employee? The Reconstruction had to move past could be and reach makes sense. The third step was access. Electronic keycards leave a trail. Time of opening, access attempt, failure, entry. The room door recorded entries consistent with the victim, and only the victim. No extra card openings. This is the kind of data that leads police to conclude quickly. No one entered, therefore it was suicide. But MINDTRACE didn't treat the log as absolute truth. It treated it as surface. Because there are two ways someone can enter a room: with a system record, or with our attention erased from the record. Hotels have operational redundancy, doors with physical mechanisms, internal locks, maintenance routines, and emergency exceptions. The investigation wasn't about teaching vulnerabilities, it was about recognizing that in complex environments, there are always side paths, and methodical offenders study side paths like obsessive students. The fourth step was the fall. From a forensic standpoint, a fall is a puzzle of physics and behavior. Position, distance from the facade, probable trajectory line, height, possible obstacles. The examiners took measurements. What interested MINDTRACE was this. Was the distance of the body from the wall consistent with a voluntary leap? Or did it align better with another dynamic? The answer wasn't categorical. And for the Replicator, that ambiguity was gold. Ambiguity feeds rushed closures. But the team insisted on unglamorous details. Minimal marks on the balcony, presence of dust particles, micro scratches, and any sign of contact at points where the body might have touched. There were no clear signs of a struggle. There were also no clear signs of the emotional preparation typical of an impulsive act. The room was too organized for an improvised end. The fifth step was the note. The note was positioned beside the hotel notepad, in an almost symbolic gesture. Crime as writing, death as publication. Liz Murray observed the choice of placement as a wordless sentence. The Replicator wanted to be read, not by the victim, by investigators and the academic community. The encryption, analyzed by consulted specialists, followed the pattern of previous notes. It wasn't long, it wasn't a manifesto, it was a seal. The content, once deciphered, repeated the same sentence. For MINDTRACE, the insistence mattered more than the coding method. Repetition is identity. Repetition is need. Teach my work. The sixth step was to connect the 5 cases without falling into the trap of the means of death. Mark Henderson built a matrix on the board with simple columns: victim, public role, location, what the scene suggested, what the scene hid, where the note was placed, which routines were manipulated. And there, a coherence emerged that no one had written before. The victims were chosen not only because they were tied to criminology, but because they were people who produce content, classes, reports, books, lectures. The locations shared a common trait: environments where normality is a strong cover. A rental apartment, an organized home, a public area, a hotel. The note always appeared near an object tied to record keeping: a book, paper, a writing surface, an envelope, an item that symbolizes documentation. The Replicator wasn't just eliminating traces. He was building a theater in which the set spoke the language of academia. The seventh step was to look for the first human flaw. Offenders who overclean often have one weakness: they repeat a ritual, and rituals leave patterns. MINDTRACE asked the lab to compare environmental residues across the 5 locations, not to look for a magic substance, but to look for unlikely coincidences. Similar fibers, consistent particles, signs of cleaning products with a similar profile, specific dusts from a particular type of glove or cloth. Small things, but persistent ones. The result wasn't an arrest. It was something more important: the beginning of a minimal material signature. An indication that behind the perfection, there was a habit. and habits are psychological traces. By the end of the Reconstruction, MINDTRACE reached a cold conclusion. The fifth case was designed to close quickly as suicide, and at the same time, humiliate the method with the note. The Replicator wanted two things at once: operational invisibility and symbolic visibility. He wanted the police to find nothing, and the academic world to talk about everything. Part 5. For MINDTRACE, profiling the Replicator was not an exercise in imagining a monster. It was an objective task, identifying what internal need is so overwhelming that it justifies 5 meticulously constructed scenes, and why that need refuses to stop. Dr. Liz Murray wrote the central point on the board in a sentence that sounded more like a diagnosis than a hypothesis. He doesn't want to kill. He wants to be inevitable. Death here functioned as a means. The real end was something else: recognition, but not the common kind, news coverage or fame. The Replicator sought a very specific form of validation: intellectual validation, reference-level validation. His dream wasn't to appear, it was to be cited. That is a refined form of narcissism, and for that very reason, more dangerous. Intellectual narcissism, vanity disguised as merit. The dominant trait wasn't theatrical exhibitionism, it was intellectual narcissism, the belief in superiority based on ability, precision, technique. This type of profile often despises others' emotions not out of anger but out of hierarchy. Empathy isn't denied through violence, it's denied through rational indifference. In the Replicator's internal world, the victims weren't complete people. They were functions: professor, expert, author. Pieces of a system he wants to dominate. He doesn't attack individuals alone, he attacks symbols of authority. And by attacking symbols, he tries to occupy their place. The note, "Teach my work," reveals an almost academic self-image. He sees himself as a producer of knowledge, as if he were publishing a thesis in chapters. The encryption reinforces this identity. He doesn't want to be understood by just anyone. He wants to be deciphered by the qualified, by those who deserve it. That alone is a narcissistic filter. Those who understand are inside the club. Those who don't are inferior. Obsession and obsessive-compulsive traits. Ritual as security. Jay Carter described the Replicator as someone with a strong tendency toward obsession with control, possibly with obsessive-compulsive personality traits, not to be confused with the classic clinical disorder of OCD. In practical terms, this shows up in how he plans, cleans, organizes, and repeats patterns. Perfection is not a neutral skill, it's a psychological defense. People like this try to neutralize anxiety through order. Ritual isn't just method, it's soothing. By aligning a bed like a scale model, by reducing environmental unpredictables, he reduces his internal sense of vulnerability. The crucial detail: the Replicator doesn't clean only to avoid being caught. He cleans to sustain a fantasy of supremacy. To him, leaving traces would be admitting humanity, and he doesn't want to be human. He wants to be a model. Cognitive sadism. Pleasure in frustrating, not in hurting. When the word sadism comes up, many people imagine graphic violence. Here the mechanism is different. The Replicator appears to operate through cognitive sadism, pleasure in confusing, frustrating, and mentally humiliating. The target of the sadism isn't just the victim. It's the investigator. It's the professor who will try to explain the case and fail. It's the expert who will examine the scene and realize their method was anticipated. It's the academic community that lives to decipher, forced to recognize that someone has written a better riddle than they have. The phrase "teach my work" is a provocation that carries contempt and hunger at the same time. Contempt for others' methods, hunger for attention. He wants to see others struggle, wants to see the debate, wants to see mistakes, and above all, he wants to see the repetition of his imagined name, the Replicator, as a concept. The curriculum logic, crimes as progressive chapters. Mark Henderson proposed a model that gave structure to the series. The Replicator follows a curriculum framework. Each death is a lesson with a different theme. The method itself doesn't matter. What matters is what it teaches about investigation. The hanging teaches about suicides and how quickly they're closed. The poisoning teaches about the fragility of evidence when the agent is hard to trace. The blunt trauma teaches about staged accidents. The gunshot teaches about easy narratives like robbery. The hotel fall teaches about monitored environments where control can still be taken. The goal is to induce predictable behavior in police and media. Label, close, move on. And then he appears with the note, as if correcting the exam of those who failed. This logic suggests progression. A narcissistic professor doesn't teach 5 classes without planning a final assessment. That idea alone raises the risk. The 6th case may be designed to be the most discussed, the hardest to ignore, the most didactic, or the most humiliating. Linked to criminology, wounded belonging and symbolic revenge. The most delicate point of the profile is the possible personal link between the replicator and the world he attacks. He doesn't choose random victims to draw attention. He chooses people who speak the language he speaks. That indicates familiarity, and often an old wound. MINDTRACE works with a recurring concept. The aggressor targets what he desires and hates at the same time. He may have been someone marginalized in academic circles, rejected, underestimated, ignored, or someone who believes he was robbed of his natural place of brilliance. Crime becomes revenge. If they didn't give his intelligence space, he creates a stage no one can take away from him. That's why the note doesn't say, "Catch me." It says, "Teach me." Capture would reduce him. Teaching would eternalize him. Risk of escalation. When attention becomes fuel for Liz Murray, the most dangerous element is the internal reward mechanism. Public attention, especially technical attention, feeds the replicator. It doesn't matter whether the tone is horror or condemnation. For an intellectual narcissist, being discussed is already a victory. This creates an operational dilemma. The more the city talks about the case, the more the offender may feel he's achieving his goal. But silence can also provoke escalation, because silence sounds like contempt. The replicator cannot tolerate contempt. He needs an audience. The solution, according to MINDTRACE, is to reposition the narrative. Talk less about the genius and more about the pattern. Less myth, more behavior. Narcissists hate being reduced to patterns, because patterns are common. Patterns are predictable. Patterns are mortal. Failure point. Vanity leaves traces. The profile ended with the practical field question that truly matters. Where does he fail? The answer came in 3 lines. He needs to monitor impact. He watches media, debates, events. He needs to prove superiority. He may approach criminology environments. He needs to maintain control. He repeats rituals, and rituals leave small traces. In other words, he tries to be invisible at the scene, but he's dependent on others' gaze outside the scene. And dependency is vulnerability. MINDTRACE closed the profile with a mental image that would guide the next phase. The replicator, as someone writing a thesis and checking every day to see how many people cited it. An author who pretends to despise the reader, but lives for the reader. And when a criminal lives for the reader, the investigation gains a rare chance to place a mirror in his path and wait to see if he can resist looking at himself. Part 6. Every methodical offender has a second weapon beyond planning: direction. He doesn't just want to disappear. He wants the investigation to move in the wrong direction, wasting time, reputation, and trust. In the replicator's case, false leads weren't improvised. They were part of the curriculum. In the first 48 hours after the 5th case, Ann Arbor turned into a board with too many pieces. Local media began competing for experts to comment on the perfect series. True crime podcasts rushed to record episodes. Academic forums and closed criminology groups filled with analysis. And that's exactly where the replicator got what he wanted most: technical audience. The problem was that along with the audience came noise. And noise is an author's best ally when he wants to control the narrative. MINDTRACE asked to quietly monitor 3 things at the same time: What police were pursuing, what the media were repeating, and what the academic community was speculating about. The false leads would be born at the intersection of those three lines. The first false lead appeared as coherence. A detective found in the hotel victim's history recent messages with a graduate student who had publicly disagreed with one of her articles. It became a perfect mental shortcut. Intellectual conflict, university town, suspicious death. Local investigators did what many do under pressure. They linked cause and effect simply because they were close in time. The student was interrogated. He had an alibi. He had a traceable routine. Above all, he had the kind of fear that looks like guilt to those who want a quick solution. MINDTRACE didn't dismiss him out of compassion. They dismissed him through pattern reading. That type of suspect was too good to be true, and far too weak to be the replicator. An anxious grad student doesn't build 5 clean scenes and still construct a coherent symbolic narrative. The replicator had operational maturity and a hunger for recognition. That was just a ready-made distraction. The second false lead came disguised as technology. A hotel IT technician reported an attempted unauthorized access to the corporate Wi-Fi that night. That led police to imagine a hacker, someone wiping cameras, manipulating systems. It was seductive. It was modern. And from the replicator's perspective, perfect. It sent the investigation chasing an invisible generic enemy, spending weeks on logs and digital forensics without necessarily touching the psychological core. Jay Carter was blunt. Offenders who want to be studied rarely vanish into pure abstraction. They need a material stage. They need to see real-world effect. The replicator might use the idea of technology as a narrative mask, but the heart of the case wasn't electronic, and it was human, repetitive, ritualistic. The third false lead was subtler and more cruel. An anonymous letter sent to a small university newspaper, claiming to know who was responsible and pointing to a famous criminology professor known for provocative theories and an inflated ego. The letter was packed with references as if written by someone from the field, and it lit a fast-burning fire, the arrogant professor as a vain killer. The city loved the hypothesis because it felt morally satisfying. It was the easy narrative, the expert who became a monster. Liz Murray called it literary justice and warned, literary justice doesn't arrest anyone, it just feeds rumors. MINDTRACE analyzed the letter not to identify the author, but to feel intent. The text was built to go viral. It used technical terms with enough precision to seem legitimate, but with enough exaggeration to be shareable. It was a piece written to circulate. And the replicator is exactly that kind of author. Someone who understands how ideas spread. The fourth diversion came in the form of a false pattern. An external analyst suggested that the 5 methods of death followed a classic order from old manuals, as if the replicator were reproducing chapters from a specific book. The hypothesis gained traction because it sounded smart. And hypotheses that sound smart are dangerous. They become rails. Mark Henderson looked at it coldly. If the replicator wants to be a reference, he may play with references, but he doesn't submit to someone else's list. What he wants is to create his own list. MINDTRACE logged the possibility as bait, not direction. A narcissistic offender loves seeing people attribute a genius plan to him, even when the plan doesn't exist. That attribution alone is nourishment. Then came the most effective false lead of all, the one born inside the police themselves. A local investigator, exhausted, commented in a meeting that maybe it was just a series of tragedies with coincidences. The phrase leaked. Part of the team embraced it as hope, another part as irritation. The effect was immediate. Internal division. And internal division is what delays a case the most, because it makes the investigation argue with itself instead of with the offender. MINDTRACE treated that as a sign the replicator was achieving something. He was turning method into an ego stage. He was making police swing between panic and denial, 2 extremes that produce bad decisions. While the false leads multiplied, a new element appeared, and it didn't come from any crime scene. It came from the environment. A guest list for a criminology event scheduled to take place in Ann Arbor in the following weeks was published online. Among the names were well-known experts and authors. Along with the release, anonymous comments began to appear on forums and comment sections, suggesting that the Replicator would choose his next victim there. It wasn't a direct threat. It was a seed. To MINDTRACE, this was the Replicator adjusting the city's temperature. He didn't need to announce a sixth crime. It was enough to induce expectation. Expectation creates paranoia. Paranoia creates behavior. And behavior, for someone who hunts thoughts, leaves traces. Liz Murray defined what was happening with uncomfortable precision. The Replicator had found a way to kill before acting. Killing the sense of safety, killing trust in the method, killing the reputation of those who teach. And amid the chaos, MINDTRACE began looking for one simple thing, the detail that didn't match the confusion. Because false leads are loud, the real pattern is usually quiet. By the end of this phase, the investigation had many directions and very little ground. It felt like failure. But MINDTRACE knew this was the typical stage in cases involving criminal authors. First, they fill the room with smoke. Then, they choose who will cough. The question was, who, in that university ecosystem, was coughing at the right moment? Part 7. The turning point didn't come from a new statement, a miraculous camera angle, or a confession. It came from something far more humiliating for the Replicator. A banal detail he considered too small to deserve respect. MINDTRACE had been collecting absences. What wasn't in the scenes, what should have been there and was removed, what looked too clean to be normal. But absence by itself is a desert. You need an oasis, a minimal point that proves someone was there in a specific way. That oasis appeared when Mark Henderson asked for a comparative reanalysis of something no one usually compares, the way the scenes were cleaned. Not what was cleaned, how. In all 5 cases, forensic reports had noted a repeated characteristic, surfaces that looked immaculate, but with microzones of subtly different sheen, as if a product had been applied with the same type of cloth, the same pressure, following the same movement. It wasn't dirt, it was pattern, and pattern is personality. Jay Carter called it a kinetic signature. The human body cleans with rhythm. Rhythm reveals haste, anxiety, obsession, method. And the Replicator cleaned the way someone revises a text before publishing, patiently, and with the conviction that there is a right way. The team asked the lab for a comparison of minimal residues, nothing that taught techniques, just profiles, fiber particles, traces of common cleaning products, and a rare coincidence across different environments. The result came like a cold breath. There was enough similarity to suggest the same type of material had been used repeatedly. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a bridge, from perfect to human. Then Liz Murray asked the question that changes entire cases. If he repeats the same ritual, he has to restock the same supplies. And if he has to restock, he leaves traces in the real world. Purchases, movements, presence in specific places. In Ann Arbor, that meant one thing. The Replicator doesn't live only in crime. He lives in routine. And routine, unlike a crime scene, can't be cleaned. MINDTRACE overlaid 3 maps. 1. A map of the victims, where they lived, where they taught, where they were last seen. 2. A map of the locations, apartment, house, public area, parking lot, hotel. 3. A map of the criminology ecosystem, campus, libraries, bookstores, events, academic cafes, consulted forensic labs, announced lectures. The goal was to find a point of convergence that wasn't too obvious. A place where someone could circulate without drawing attention and, at the same time, observe specialists, absorb technical language, and choose targets. The point appeared with the discretion typical of what is true. A specific library within the university, known for its collection in criminology, forensic psychology, and investigative methodology. A place where experts and professors sometimes stop to consult rare references when they're in town. A place where writers research. A place where the Replicator could feed on content, and above all, on vanity. But a library isn't a crime scene. It's just a place. The turning point required more. And it came from the note. Up to then, everyone had treated "teach my work" as provocation. Liz Murray decided to treat it as a symptom. The phrase didn't say, "admire me" or "fear me." It said, "teach." That's the language of someone who imagines himself in an institutional position. Someone who believes his product deserves to enter a curriculum. So Liz asked the emotional question, who writes as if they were an authority? And Jay added the technical one, who writes as if they were correcting a system? The answer began to take shape when a language analyst consulted by MINDTRACE noticed something small. The phrase, in its deciphered form, always maintained the same register. Not slang, not threat, not anger. It was a clean imperative, almost academic. And in some earlier notes there were micro-variations in punctuation and spacing that suggested preference. A style of someone who writes a lot, revises a lot, controls a lot. Mark Henderson then connected this to what was already on the board. The Replicator wasn't just leaving notes. He was leaving calls for proposals, small orders directed at an audience. That's when MINDTRACE realized the collective mistake. Police were looking for a criminal who flees. But the Replicator was a criminal who stays. He wants to watch his own case become a lesson. He wants to see the debate. He wants to feel the world trying to catch up to him. That means he needs to be close to where the debate happens. Then came the piece that made everything fit. An insight so simple it seems obvious afterward. The Replicator chose victims tied to criminology. And he also chose the kinds of places where criminology circulates. He wasn't hunting people. He was hunting functions in environments of validation. MINDTRACE asked for something many would consider too small to be worth the effort. Access to attendance lists and entry records from academic events open to the public in the previous months. Lectures, panels, book launches, workshops. Not to find a name immediately, but to find a pattern. Someone who appears repeatedly, but isn't a protagonist. Someone always near the spotlight without stepping on stage. And that's where a pattern of presence emerged. Not a perfect suspect, but a behavior. An individual who attended criminology events, always alone, always discreet, always arriving early and leaving before the end. Someone who asked rare but highly technical questions. Someone who wasn't seeking friendship. He was seeking indirect validation. At some events there were records of a person asking for reading recommendations about common mistakes in scenes and about how investigations are conducted in monitored environments. It wasn't a crime to ask, but it was a kind of curiosity that smelled like a project. Jay Carter called it hunger for method. Liz Murray called it hunger for place. But the final blow against the Replicator wasn't finding that pattern. It was understanding how to use it. The crucial discovery was this: the Replicator cannot resist his own reputation. He needs to ensure the case is interpreted correctly. He needs to see the world reacting the way he planned. That means if the investigation shifts the direction of public debate, without glorifying him, without calling him a genius, without reinforcing the myth, he will feel the need to correct it. And correction is action. Action is risk. Risk is failure. So MINDTRACE designed an emotional and technical strategy. Create a controlled scenario of devaluation, take away the symbolic prize, turn his work into something common, predictable, catalogable, not as childish provocation, but as a psychological countermeasure. Intellectual narcissists collapse when reduced to pattern. Mark wrote the sentence that became the axis of the next phase on the board. If he wants to be taught, then we're going to teach him in the way he hates most. Not as praise, as classification, as reduction. And for the first time since the series began, the team felt the Replicator had been touched where it hurts most. Not in his hiding place, but in his self-image. Because a criminal who kills to become a reference cannot tolerate the idea of becoming a footnote. Part 8. The confrontation with the Replicator didn't happen in an alley or during a cinematic chase. It happened where he was most vulnerable, in the place where he needed to be recognized. MINDTRACE understood a simple principle. For this type of offender, being arrested is an operational defeat. But being ignored, or worse, reduced to a common pattern, is an existential defeat. The Replicator didn't just want to escape. He wanted to win through intellectual superiority. And intellectual superiority requires an audience. That's why the team set the trap the way one sets a mirror. Without announcing a manhunt, without heroic press conferences, police and the university coordinated a discreet public move. A technical statement, followed by an open lecture on patterns in manipulated scenes and the psychology of control. The wording of the statement didn't elevate the series. It did the opposite. It described the crimes as derivative, procedural, excessively controlled, with signs of anxiety and a need for external validation. Instead of perfection, the central word was compulsion. It was a risky strategy, not to provoke, but to remove the symbolic prize. Liz Murray insisted on one precaution. No calling the offender a genius, no framing it as an epic duel, no romanticizing. Just a cold description of patterns, as if he were a repeated case from a textbook. For an intellectual narcissist, that's a direct attack. Not on the body, on the pedestal. At first, the effect was invisible. The city went on with its life. The press picked up the statement, but it didn't have the dramatic fuel it wanted. In forums, some tried to reignite the myth of the perfect crime. But for the first time, the public narrative began to shift in tone. Less fascination, more diagnosis. Less masterpiece, more obsession. Meanwhile, Mark Henderson and Jay Carter did the quiet work, watching who can't stay still when a narrative gets it wrong. The lecture was held in a campus auditorium, open to the public. MINDTRACE wasn't looking for a specific face. They were looking for a set of micro-behaviors. Someone who arrives too early to control position, chooses a seat with a clear view of the stage and exits, avoids contact, records details, and reacts physically when a phrase threatens their self-image. The auditorium filled with students, professors, curious onlookers, plainclothes officers. An atmosphere of academic discussion. Exactly the kind of environment where the Replicator feels at home. And there, in the middle of the audience, something appeared that wasn't evidence, but was a scent. An individual alone, too discreet, too attentive. He didn't look nervous like someone afraid of being discovered. He looked tense like someone afraid of not being understood. His posture was rigid, his gaze that of an auditor, not a spectator. His hands stayed busy, as if they needed a minimal ritual to sustain control. Adjusting something, aligning something, checking something. When the lecture described the series as a set of scenes that are too clean, typical of someone who confuses rigor with value, that person showed an almost imperceptible reflex. A micro twitch in the jaw, a shift of the torso, a narrowing of focus. Jay Carter recognized what he calls a possession response, when someone feels that something that belongs to them is being used with contempt. No dialogue, no immediate approach. MINDTRACE did what it does best, followed behavior. The individual left before the end, matching the earlier pattern, and walked fast enough not to be followed by the curious, but not so fast as to draw attention. Like someone who knows the rhythm of a place and knows how to camouflage within it. Mark Henderson noticed a detail along the path. He passed through an area of bulletin boards and notices where events and reading lists were posted. He stopped for a few seconds, as if confirming a schedule, and that connected the case to something already on the table. The Replicator doesn't live in crime. He lives in the calendar. That night, MINDTRACE began operating with a new focus. Not where he killed, but where he returns. Libraries, auditoriums, book launches, seminars, cafes near campus. Places where someone can exist as a shadow, and at the same time feed on what matters most to him. Language, status, debate. The tension rose with a subtle signal. A new encrypted note appeared in a public space on campus, not tied to any death. Just a message, placed like a bookmark. When deciphered, the phrase carried a minimal addition. It wasn't a threat. It was a correction. An attempt to reclaim authority over the narrative. That was exactly what MINDTRACE needed. Because an offender who corrects the debate is making the mistake he always makes, he is interacting, and interaction creates opportunity. In the end, the confrontation wasn't a show of force. It was the closing in on a human pattern, an individual who couldn't tolerate seeing his own work treated as banal. The trap was set. His next correction would be the misstep. Part 9. The capture of the Replicator began the way the most decisive things usually do, with people pretending everything was normal. Ann Arbor had an event scheduled for the following week, a roundtable on investigative methods and criminal narrative, with well-known guests. Exactly the kind of showcase the Replicator wouldn't miss, not because he wanted to be on stage, but because he needed to ensure his case stayed alive in the discourse. MINDTRACE treated the event as a probable point of presence, not as a theatrical bait. The plan was simple on the outside and complex on the inside. Expand observation, reduce panic, discreetly protect the guests, and above all, identify who moves like someone revising a work. Jay Carter described the target in behavioral terms. Someone who arrives early, chooses a position with control, observes routes, avoids obvious cameras without acting afraid, and maintains an emotionally elevated state, not anxious, but vigilant. Mark Henderson added, someone who carries the need to leave a mark, however small. A note, a sign, a stamp. On the day of the event, the building looked the same as always. Students coming and going, coffee in hand, posters on the walls, winter light cutting through tall windows. Plainclothes officers were just more people in the flow. No sirens, no manhunt atmosphere. MINDTRACE didn't want to give the Replicator the pleasure of a grand game. The auditorium filled. The moderator began. The panel moved forward in a cautious, academic tone. And MINDTRACE, spread across strategic points, did what it does best, counted micro-decisions. He appeared again, alone, discreet, with the same pattern of early arrival. He sat where he could see both the stage and the doors. He didn't display ordinary curiosity. He displayed evaluation, as if measuring the quality of a lecture about himself. At one point, when a panelist mentioned the idea of a criminal who seeks validation and inevitably repeats rituals, the individual leaned his body slightly forward, a small reaction, but one consistent with the profile. Jay Carter didn't need a confession. He needed consistency. The team waited for the most revealing movement, the exit. He left before the end, as always, and followed a side corridor leading to less crowded areas, near a smaller library and a set of tables with pamphlets and notepads. And then, the gesture. A quick, almost elegant movement. The hand reaching the edge of a table, something being placed among ordinary papers. Not a large object, a detail, a marker, a discrete signature. That was the operational turning point. Not just suspect present, but suspect interacting with the environment in a ritualistic way. Mark Henderson relayed the essential over the internal channel. The Replicator was trying to publish again. The approach wasn't aggressive. It was technical. No crowd, no running, no theater. Two agents came closer, as if asking for information, while another monitored hands and roots. Jay Carter watched the face not for guilt, but for the emotion most likely in an exposed intellectual narcissist. Silent indignation, as if the world were violating protocol with him. There was no explosive scene. There was a moment of freezing, that microsecond when someone realizes they've lost control of the narrative. And it was there that MINDTRACE confirmed what it had always been looking for. Not force, but fracture. The containment was clean, without prolonged struggle, without visible impact. The Replicator tried to do what he always did, maintain composure, maintain control, maintain superiority. But control, when it's compulsive, collapses when someone else holds the pen. The note he had left was carefully collected, encrypted like the others. Same paper style, same language tone, the same ritual of placement. And in the inner pocket of his coat, materials that didn't prove crimes by themselves, but proved obsession. Clippings, notes, Event lists, bibliographic references, screenshots of online discussions, names and schedules marked. It wasn't a crime kit. It was an archive, an ego archive. In the interrogation room, MINDTRACE kept the discipline of the case. No theatrical verbal duel, no giving him a stage. Liz Murray simply observed the phenomenon with clinical detachment. He didn't look like someone overwhelmed by remorse or panic. He looked like someone irritated at being interpreted wrong, like an author reading a bad review. That's when the team applied the final part of the strategy, taking from him the only thing he wanted. Without direct dialogue, without provocation, the institutional posture was one of classification. He wasn't a legend. He was a pattern. He wasn't a masterpiece. He was a case of compulsive control and external validation. A description that didn't elevate him, it reduced him. For him, that was worse than handcuffs. The arrest was formalized based on the accumulation of elements. Repeated presence at events linked to the victims, language and cryptography patterns, ritual consistency, connection to academic convergence locations, and above all, the direct interaction with the note at the event, a behavioral signature captured in real time. The city exhaled but didn't celebrate, because there was no comfortable heroism there. There was an uncomfortable truth. Someone had managed to turn a place's intellectual life into fuel for a series of didactic deaths, and that leaves scars. At the end of the day, MINDTRACE closed the case with an internal phrase, not as victory, but as warning. When crime becomes curriculum, the next step is turning people into chapters, and Ann Arbor almost did. Part 10. There is a kind of violence that doesn't need spectacle to destroy. It destroys by rearrangement. It takes routine, a hotel, a hallway, a lecture, a library, and places inside it the feeling that any gesture could be part of a secret plot. That's what the Replicator tried to do in Ann Arbor. Not just take lives, but hijack the meaning of things. Turn spaces of knowledge into scenes of fear. Turn people who teach into study material. MINDTRACE learned once again a bitter rule. Not every criminal wants to run. Some want to remain, not physically, but as an idea. They want to be remembered, cited, repeated. And when that's the motivation, the greatest risk isn't the next crime, it's the next narrative. Because there is a silent danger in cases like this. The temptation to treat the perpetrator as a myth, to call him a genius, to grant him the title he begs for without ever asking. And the modern world with its hunger for stories offers a stage far too easily. The answer isn't to erase the case, it's to frame the case the right way. Teach, yes, but teach the truth he would have hated, that behind the perfection there was compulsion, repetition, need, fragility. That behind the cryptography there was a hunger for validation. That behind the control there was fear of being ordinary. The capture of the Replicator was not the end of what he tried to plant. Doubt lingers in the cracks. What if there's another? What if the city is being watched? But little by little, method takes back its place. The investigation becomes the author again. The community learns to breathe without imagining every room as a scene. And maybe that's the most important lesson. A crime may try to become a lesson, but it doesn't have to become a tribute. The same intelligence someone uses to destroy can also be used to prevent, protect, and understand. In the end, MINDTRACE holds to the motto born from these impossible cases. They don't chase criminals. They chase thoughts and behaviors. And when they succeed, what remains isn't glory, it's responsibility. Because teaching a case is necessary, but teaching without reverence is essential.